June 25, 1950. Across the 38th parallel, North Korean forces launched a devastating surprise attack. Within days, their Soviet-built tanks rolled into Seoul, shattering the fragile peace of the peninsula. Caught unprepared, the Republic of Korea Army and early arriving U.S. forces were driven south. The retreat was swift, chaotic, and desperate as UN lines buckled under the onslaught. By August, UN forces clung to a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan. This was the last stand. Pushed further, they would be driven into the sea. General Douglas MacArthur gambled everything on a daring amphibious landing far behind enemy lines. On September 15th, Operation Chromite struck Incheon. The Incheon landing was a stunning success. North Korean supply lines were severed, and UN forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter, rapidly advancing north. Seoul was recaptured by the end of September. The UN coalition, now in pursuit, pushed past the 38th parallel, aiming to unify the entire Korean Peninsula. As UN units neared the Yalu River, the border with China, warnings from Beijing were dismissed. The cost of this strategic miscalculation would be immense. In late October and November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers poured across the Yalu. They struck with overwhelming force, shattering UN lines. The UN forces faced a brutal, desperate retreat in the face of the Chinese offensive. This was the longest retreat in U.S. military history, compounded by the rapidly dropping temperatures. At the Chosin Reservoir, elements of the 1st Marine Division were encircled. In sub-zero temperatures, they fought their way out in an epic, brutal breakout. The port of Hungnam became the scene of a massive evacuation. Over 100,000 UN troops and Korean refugees were lifted by sea under constant enemy fire. Seoul fell again in January 1951, marking another low point for the UN. However, new leadership under General Matthew Ridgway began to stabilize the front. The war settled into a brutal stalemate along the 38th parallel. Winter fighting became endemic, with soldiers battling not just the enemy, but extreme cold, snow, and ice. In the skies, a new form of combat unfolded. MiG Alley became the battleground for American F-86 Sabres and Soviet-built North Korean and Chinese MiG-15s. Un-Air Power waged a relentless interdiction campaign. Bridges, supply depots, and troop concentrations became targets, crippling the enemy's logistical network. On the ground, complex logistics kept the multinational UN forces supplied. Everything from ammunition to medical supplies had to traverse treacherous terrain. Engineers worked tirelessly, repairing roads and constructing bridges under fire. Their efforts were critical to maintaining troop mobility and supply lines. Medical units, like the iconic MASH hospitals, brought advanced care close to the front. Helicopters evacuated the wounded, saving countless lives. The war became a grind of static trench warfare, patrols, and intense artillery duels. Small, bloody battles erupted over strategic hills, often with heavy casualties. Soldiers endured endless days and nights in foxholes, facing mortar fire, sniper attacks, and the constant threat of enemy raids across no man's land. Beyond the 38th parallel, the war was a global effort. 16 nations contributed combat troops, and 5 provided medical support, demonstrating UN solidarity. Naval forces maintained a critical blockade, launching bombardments and protecting the crucial sea lanes. Aircraft carriers provided vital air support. Propaganda campaigns were waged by both sides. Loudspeakers blared messages across the lines, and millions of leaflets were dropped, aiming to demoralize the enemy. Armistice talks began in July 1951, first at Kaesong, then Panmunjom. But the fighting dragged on for 2 more agonizing years as negotiations stalled. A major sticking point was the repatriation of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese POWs refused to return home, creating a diplomatic deadlock. Even as talks continued, fierce battles erupted for strategic hilltops like Porkchop Hill and Old Baldy. These costly engagements sought to gain leverage at the peace table. In April 1953, Operation Little Switch saw the exchange of sick and wounded POWs. It was a hopeful sign, clearing the path for a general prisoner exchange. 3 months later, Operation Big Switch began. Over 75,000 communist prisoners and nearly 13,500 UN and ROK prisoners were repatriated, many with emotional reunions. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. 3 years and 1 month after the initial invasion, the guns fell silent. The armistice established a demilitarized zone, a heavily fortified buffer splitting the peninsula near the 38th parallel. A stark, enduring border was drawn. The war ended without a formal peace treaty, only a ceasefire. Technically, the two Koreas remain in a state of war to this day, a frozen conflict spanning generations. Korean War cost millions of lives, both military and civilian. For a time, it was often called the Forgotten War in the West, overshadowed by WW II and Vietnam. Yet its impact was profound, solidifying the Cold War, shaping military doctrine, and proving the UN could act decisively against aggression. Decades later, the Korean Peninsula remains divided, a poignant symbol of a bitter conflict. The images captured by its cameramen are a raw reminder of its human cost.